I think it's really important to finish things. There's that idea that done is better than perfect. Um, we all have ideas, we all have these projects that we're working on, and it's the projects that are finished that really make the difference. If I could do it over again, I probably would have started with a shorter story. You learn so much through the process of making a comic, so if you're able to create a shorter story and learn along the way, but very quickly complete something, I think that that's really powerful and a really good way to, if you want to break into the comic world, that's a really great way to do it.
Hello, my name is Annie, and you are listening to World of Webcomics, a podcast in which I interview comic creators who are telling their story in the exciting new world of online. I was super pumped to talk to today's guest, and I am very grateful for her giving me her time. I read her comic in almost one sitting, which, as an artist myself, I know it didn't take one sitting to draw. Rest assured that I definitely still appreciated the art along the way because the visuals and environments and characters are so professional and well done, but the story is so addictive and very relatable and real. But I will let her introduce herself and her story. Without further ado, let's go to the interview.
All right. So, for those who might not know, could you introduce yourself and tell us maybe what you are known for?
Yeah, so I'm Anna Meyer, and I'm known for the webcomic St. Catherine.
Excellent. And were you always into art? How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, I would say growing up, I definitely had a big imagination, so I was always creating stories and my own characters. So drawing and art was sort of the best way to see my stories take shape, and sort of see those characters on the page. So I drew a lot. And then, of course, sort of the next step of drawing was putting the stories out scene by scene. So comics were sort of a natural progression.
Right. So, what specifically about comics made you kind of focus in on that niche?
Yeah, well, I think, for one, growing up, I grew up on Marvel comics like X-Men, X-Styles, Spider-Man, and Daredevil. So, like, definitely has a special place in my heart from when I was little. But it just, for me, it was the most sort of accessible medium. I think what's great about it is, I'm not the best writer, so writing a book didn't really seem really feasible to me. But comics, like, it was this great way to sort of tell stories visually while also seeing those stories in my head become fully realized.
Definitely. And more on the point of accessibility, it's interesting because, as I understand it, you are actually creating St. Catherine as a traditional comic and then reformatting it for Webtoon. Is that right?
Yeah, it's sort of I want to say, like, I'm doing almost all, like, both web and like digital and print sort of simultaneously. I sort of started St. Catherine as a web comic in the sort of more traditional sense, that sort of more old school web comic format where you have like the first, last, previous sort of website, just because it was a good way to sort of upload my story. And I love graphic novels, and it's always been a sort of a dream of mine to create a full graphic novel. But sitting down to draw an entire, like, 300-page graphic novel is really daunting. Whereas I think the great thing about web comics is you can sort of upload them weekly in like smaller chunks, and it's a lot more. It's easier to do, essentially. So basically, while I do want to get it printed, I like to have it online because people can read it, and I think that's really great. So when it is finished, it will be fully printed too. So it'll live both digitally and in print.
Excellent. And I believe people can purchase volumes of it now. Is that right as well?
Yeah, so about every 50 to 70 pages, I'll print a volume of it, mainly because I love print and I love being able to hold something physical in my hands. So it's a great way, people can read it if they want to have a physical copy.
Excellent. And where can people find that?
So I have a site. It's sort of my personal site. It's annacmeyer.com. And yeah, so there's a shop, and I have some prints available as well as volume one is currently sold out, but I'm currently working on printing volume two, and then I will also print volume one, and so those will both be available very soon.
Yeah, I was bummed. I came late to the party. I wanted, I'm excited for you to make those available again. So
Yeah, I did a small run just in case, like nobody, I didn't want to have a like 200 comic books just under my bed, but so I,
that is understandable. Yeah.
yeah, so that's exciting.
So, could you speak more on your relationship with webcomics specifically and how you decided on Webtoon as a platform?
Yeah, Webtoon I kind of found out about while I was already sort of making St. Catherine. I was maybe 30 pages in, I'd say. And I was like, well, you know what? This is, kind of a good way to get the comic out there. And I started uploading on there, and it took off, which is really crazy. And I think Webtoon allowed me to reach an audience that I never would have reached sort of on my own. And in time, I sort of learned how to reformat it to Webtoon. The great thing about Webtoon is I think that they've really optimized the like digital comic reading experience. That sort of old school format that I was talking about earlier is really not a great user experience, I would say. Whereas the sort of vertical scroll, especially since everyone's on mobile, is just really great to read a lot of comics and read them in a really, like a way that just flows really naturally. So yeah, that's how I found Webtoon.
I couldn't agree more. As someone who is trying to make it work in both formats, are there any unique challenges to making it a user friendly or reader friendly experience when trying to do it both print and digital?
Yeah, I think it's hard because there's definitely um, when you're doing a print comic, there are sort of best practices, and there are ways you sort of format your story and your panels to read well, like in a book form or in a page format. And then with Webtoon, there's definitely a way to make the story really work in that vertical scrolling. And you kind of can't have the best of both worlds. And for me, because it is going to be printed, and I think it's a lot harder to take a sort of very digital vertical scroll format and move it into print, sort of. And initially I was sort of going for the page print format, so it makes more sense for me to sort of focus on how my story flows from a print and page standpoint, and then sort of just move it in panel by panel on Webtoon. You know, Maybe if I created a Webtoon sort of down the line that was exclusively for Webtoon, I would maybe format it in a different way. I see people you do these like large floods of color and sort of these more vertical layouts, whereas that doesn't really always work in print. Um, so that's what I would say. But first and foremost, I really try to focus on making the story make sense from a page standpoint.
That makes sense. Is this the first story that you have tried to do as a webcomic and shared online?
No, it's not. I've had two, failed attempts before. I learned a lot from them, so I don't know if I would say they're a complete failure. But back in high school, I started a story, and it kind of just started off that I drew a few pages. Again, that's sort of just wanting to see these scenes in my head on paper. And then I started posting it I actually uploaded it on DeviantArt. That was sort of where I put these pages, and I did that for about 3 years, I'd say, and then just I sort of lost interest in the story, and also it was a story that just was not planned out that well. So I knew I wanted to create a comic. So I was like, okay, my next web comic, like I'm gonna plan everything out. That last one, like I had no idea what I was doing. So my strategy was I was going to write the entire script of this next web comic before I drew anything, which I found didn't work because first and foremost, I'm an artist and I want to draw things. So I did not get very far at all because what really excites me about storytelling is sort of the visual aspect of it. So those are sort of my two previous attempts.
That's perfect because that kind of leads me into another question I had for you, and we can get into the kind of the technical aspects of it as well. But how for you do you approach writing? Because it seems like for you, is it kind of a combination of the visual and the written?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're doing comics, like you have to sort of look at those two symbiotically. Like you can't look
Mm.
at them sort of individually, um, because I don't think you're taking full advantage of the medium. You have this great opportunity where you are using words and you're using dialogue and language, but also you get to use visuals too. I think it varies between artists and storytellers as to how visual or how sort of language focused they want their stories to be. But I think a really successful comic really marries those two elements.
Definitely. They're kind of dependent on each other rather than working on their own. And I think that's why a lot of times projects that are written and drawn by the same person seem so fleshed out and symbiotic, like you said.
Yeah, I would agree. And there are some really great graphic novels I love that are drawn by someone and written by another. But I definitely think there probably has to be like a lot of collaboration there to make sure the writer and the artist are really on the same page.
Definitely. And I know you mentioned a program in your Q&A episode. Is it Miro? Is that right?
Yeah, so Miro is it's actually a program I found through my work, and it's a lot of like program developers use it. It's sort of like a UX UI program, but I looked at it and I was like, this would be great for storytelling. Like this is great for scripting and outlining, and it is free. Like if you sign up for free, I think you get limited like 5 boards, but I don't think you need any more than that. But it's a great way to sort of visually plot out like you could do dialogue in there. You can put images. So if you maybe have some like character designs, you can throw in there. One of my favorite things that I did in Miro that I think really helps my story is I actually created a calendar and I've plotted out the what happens in the story day by day. So there's actually dates to each thing that happens in the story, which I never bring up in the comic, but it helps me sort of you know, keep things make sense, so the reader isn't confused like, did this happen 5 days ago or a month ago? So there's a lot of really cool, ways that you can use that tool.
Well, there you go. That's a good tool to use that I wasn't aware of before. So that's nice to know. So
Okay.
for plotting and the writing aspect, is the story something that you have all figured out? Because I know you'd mentioned like, okay, we're at the third waypoint. So it seems like you kind of know where everything's going. Is that right?
Yes, everything is definitely very planned out. And before I started um, sort of uploading St. Catherine, I did a lot of planning beforehand. So I could sort of go into the story knowing where things were going to go. But yes, especially at this point, a third of the way through, like I have a very clear outline. The script it's not completely done, but it's maybe about 5 scenes ahead of where we are now. So yes, there's a very clear direction, beginning, middle, and end.
Good. So I think based on your previous experience and for maybe someone who is listening and thinking about how to go about their story, it seems like you're advocating for an in between where it's like know where you're going, but like don't write yourself into a corner, but
Yeah,
at the same time, like have that freedom too.
Absolutely. Like, I don't think you should lock yourself into anything. There's absolutely scenes that I added very last minute that I think really have helped sort of some of the character development. Like, there's a flashback scene that I decided to add in about like maybe 3 pages before it happened, and I think it really helped flesh out the characters, and it, definitely, it paused sort of my trajectory, but I definitely think that added time makes it worth it. Um, you sort of have to be flexible with your stories. I've always heard this term of like the plotter and the planter. Sort of like the plotter is you go about your story with a very clear outline and you don't stray from it, and you have your plot points very clearly written out. Um, Whereas a planter is more like you have this general idea, you have some characters, and you just start to write them and sort of see where they go. And I think a balance between those two things is important because you don't make your story too rigid, but also you allow for the story to sort of go in a direction that makes sense, sort of based on the decisions that the characters have made so far.
I agree, yeah. And comparing previous projects to this now, how do you feel that your storytelling has evolved?
I would say I understand a little more sort of setting things up and paying them off, sort of being able to, when you introduce some sort of a plot point, having a really clear idea of like how that sort of pays off for the story or for the characters in the end. But another thing I think I've really learned is the importance of character growth, like sort of there needs to be something that the character learns. It doesn't need to be, I think, a big like change, but there needs to be some sort of you look at the character how they were at the beginning, and then at the end you can see sort of this clear difference in sort of maybe the lessons that they've learned or how their character has changed. And I don't know if I thought about that as much in the past. And that's something that I really tried to, with St. Catherine, I really tried to always keep in mind, not only with the main character, but with even secondary characters, sort of as well.
Would you say that that is the main priority for you when you are telling a story to show character growth, or what other things do you keep in mind as far as the actual story that you're telling?
Yeah, I think for me, character growth is important. I think there needs to be the reader has to sort of understand the character and they have to a certain degree like the character. They don't have to always be likable, but there has to be some sort of interest there. Like there's something about this character that interests you that you continue to come back and want to hear what they have to say or see what happens next to them in this next scenario. So that's important to me. I also think, you know, having the story have a point, sort of that like, what is the point of the story? Like, what are you trying to say with this story? Um, those having a clear theme and having fleshed out characters that are enjoyable to sort of watch is important to me too.
Definitely. And I think that you can see from the reactions of people, like looking at the comments, that it is a very relatable story. Both, I mean, we talked a little bit before we started recording about how it might be resonant for someone who has a bit of Catholic guilt that they're dealing with. But I think it can be universal in the sense that trying to reconcile becoming your own person while respecting tradition and where you come from. That's something I think that a lot of people can connect with. And on that note, I'd like to ask you about how did you come up with the idea for St. Catherine?
Yeah, so it initially started a long time ago. I sort of just had the idea of, I've always loved stories that are, for the most part, sort of based in reality, but have some sort of supernatural aspect. And I just had this idea bouncing around in my head about, someone who was possessed by demons, but just sort of going about their day. Like everything around them is still seemingly pretty mundane, but they have sort of these demons that they're carrying around. I've always had this sort of fascination with demonology and exorcisms, so I had that idea bouncing around, but for the longest time, I could never find sort of what the point of that was. Like, okay, like, well, what would be the plot that would sort of happen around this? And so in time, I kept on coming back to this story, and it just sort of seemed like a really the sort of clear direction was to sort of tap into my own experiences, being raised very strictly Catholic and sort of how that has an effect on someone long term. I think it's really interesting. I can, talk about it in length. So when I paired those two together, sort of this idea of um, the long term effects of sort of religion and religious indoctrination, paired with this sort of fun supernatural demon aspect. I just thought that that was a really interesting story to tell.
And that's something that initially intrigued me about when I first came across it too, is that your two chosen categories are supernatural and slice of life, which are not ones that you would normally pair together.
Yeah.
Do you think that genre plays an important role at all in telling your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, initially genre is a good way to sort of get readers. I think everyone gravitates to certain genres. So to sort of build an audience, then yeah, I would say genre is important. Um, but I do feel that at the end of the day, your story should just be, it should sort of be the story that makes sense for the characters you've built and sort of the theme you developed. And genre is maybe one of those things that you look at your story and you're like, okay, I guess what bucket does this fit into?
Right. It's sort of something you label it rather than what drives the whole thing, I guess.
Yeah. Hmm.
And you also mention the concept of the death of the author. It's uh, obviously kind of a personal story, but
Yeah.
for you, could you elaborate on that and how you would like people to interpret things on their own?
Yeah, so that whole concept of the death of the author is, I think, in its form is very idealistic. I don't think there can ever fully be a death of the author. I don't think it's a secret that this story is definitely autobiographical, sans the sort of supernatural elements. Um, but for the most part, the people that read this don't know me, and so sort of my own personal experiences don't really affect the story that they read as much as like how they sort of interpret it. And with a platform like Webtoon, like it's also sort of a social platform, so you really clearly see how people are reacting to it and sort of how they're interpreting it, which, especially with this story, has been really interesting and really different than sort of anything that I've done in the past. And I get a lot of questions about people asking me, like, what I think about Catholicism, religion, and like all these other different, really sort of loaded questions. And I see all the different ways people interpret it. Like some people see it as a more positive sort of look at Catholicism, and some people see it in a really negative light. And there's a certain degree where I don't want to get into the comments and like tell people, blatantly what it is or what it isn't. I think that it's sort of up to the reader to sort of decide. I definitely know sort of what I'm trying to say with it, and I think it'll be clear sort of when the story is complete, sort of where I land on things. But again, especially when you're dealing with a topic like religion and Catholicism, that's um, really complex and really has a different meaning for everyone. I think that's sort of gonna just happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously I could be potentially a very touchy subject, and I think that the story is very tactful in how it deals with it. I think by taking a personal approach, it's also a nuanced and complex approach. So kudos to you for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think the main thing is like you know, with St. Catherine, I'm not so much trying to talk to the sort of, institutional aspects of Catholicism. I'm more trying to explore it from an individual level. I'm trying to sort of explore like what does Catholicism, how does that affect one person? It's going to affect, different people in many different ways. So my approach is just to see that sort of individual level.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. As far as seeing people interacting with it as a web comic, have you gotten any crazy theories as well, or has anybody guessed anything right?
Yeah, there's a lot of different theories, and and I think when you're uploading things at a sort of slower pace, maybe like a few pages a week, um, people really dissect every little aspect of it. So I'll get people saying like, the tattoos mean this, or like this thing, I think that this means that, whatever sort of, aspect they think it might be. And I'm like, I just kind of drew that because I thought it looked cool. It's not. There's one flashback scene where the demons are, of course, a plot point, but they also, I think, add an extra visual element. I think they add a lot of contrast, and they're a really good framing element. And there's one flashback scene where I just added them in for a little more visual intrigue, and people were like, "The demons have been there all along," and I can clearly say that they have not. That was not that was not what I intended. It was just sort of me adding something a little more visual. But yeah, people have guessed things right. They've guessed things incorrectly. I'm not gonna say now, but yeah, it's interesting to see people reacting to it in real time.
Do you feel like there has to be like a degree of separation between like seeing people react to it and like not wanting to change anything as a result?
Yeah, so sort of with Webtoon, there's the ability for people to add comments, and you can sort of see in real time how people are reacting to your story. And I think when you see that, like, it's really natural to want to sort of tailor to the fans. Like, people will say like, "Oh, this character was being toxic," or they'll maybe interpret something in a way that I didn't initially intend. And my sort of knee-jerk reaction is to overcompensate in some way, like, "Oh, well, maybe if I add in another scene, or the next time I show that character, I have them do this extra thing that sort of, fixes that problem they might have seen." But then I think you sort of run into the issue of, you're maybe tailoring your story a little bit too much for an audience, and maybe just a few people, like a very small audience, like a very small section of your readers, and not necessarily telling the original story you intended. So while I love reading the comments, and I think it's really interesting to see how people interpret it, I definitely try to stick to the original story I intended.
Definitely. I think that's really good advice for someone who is maybe scared of audience reaction and is kind of questioning if they should post or not.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like if there are some like really good points that people bring up, like if something is truly problematic, then maybe it's like not so much to tailor to specifically to what they want, but maybe just sort of look at your story again and look at and see if there's ways that you can sort of tweak things a little bit, to sort of bring things on the right path. Because it's definitely very, feasible that maybe something you saw in your mind is not coming across the way that you were initially intended. Like, that happens.
Yeah, there's a balance there for sure.
Yeah.
But before people can even react, could you take us through the process of what it's like from writing to actually posting? What goes into creating an episode?
Yeah, so sort of like I said, I have a pretty clear outline. So I have a sort of rough outline that's just like really basic plot points, and then I have a more detailed outline. And then from that, I have a script. My script looks kind of like a screenplay or like a play. No one ever really reads it, except maybe if I want to get some feedback from some people. So it's very loosely written. The dialogue is tight, but some of the directions are a little more loose. But from there, I create sort of rough thumbnails, and then from those rough thumbnails, I bring it into Procreate. I used to use Photoshop, but I got an iPad thinking it would, I was like, well, I'll maybe just use it to assist my drawing, and I've actually moved everything over to Procreate. I think it's a really great program. And so then I draw out my panels based on my thumbnail, and then the next thing I do is I add in my dialogue. That way I can make sure sort of when I draw the characters, I draw the scenes. You're not running into the issue of like a speech bubble covering it, or sometimes I found I used to sort of draw the speech bubbles and then try to fit the text in, and it just was not great. So, and yeah, then once I have the sketch, I sort of clean it up, do the line work, and add in my tones. And then from there, to sort of format it to Webtoon, I bring it into a program called Sketch and sort of, move it into that vertical layout. And yeah, that's sort of how I make an episode.
Great. And thank you again for indulging me in all the storytelling questions. As far
Yeah.
as the visual aspect, who would you attribute to being your major influences?
Yeah, so I would say, growing up, comics and definitely anime, and then sort of more, Studio Ghibli, I think, is definitely an influence. I think a lot of people say that. I mean, they have had such an intense sort of visual impact on storytelling. But as far as comics that I really love, I really like Jen Wong a lot. I like Tilly Walden, of course. There's a really amazing webcomic that it was actually done on Instagram, and it's only done in like the summer. It's uploaded from like I think July to August, and it's called Ete. And it's a French sort of webcomic that is drawn by Marie Spinel, and it's just really beautiful. I would definitely recommend checking it out for the art. But yeah, I would say that those are sort of my visual influences.
And I know that you have like a regular 9 to 5 job with some creative aspects. Did you go to school for art, or where does your training come from?
I would say for the most part, my training sort of comes. It's more sort of self-taught. I went to a like a small graphic design school for about like a 2-year program. So most of the schooling that I've had was more centered around design. I did have a few illustration classes, but most of the stuff I've learned is just from sort of following people that inspired me. And there's a lot of really great resources. I think one of the great things about art is, especially now with YouTube and a lot of different sort of teaching applications, it's really accessible to everyone. So, yeah, for the most part, it's just been a lot of practice, I'd say.
Definitely. What advice would you give to someone who is maybe a younger artist and is still developing their style? How do they develop their own voice?
Yeah, I would say, definitely surround yourself by good reference. I do believe you're only as good as your best reference. So seek out, good stories, good art, and then sort of trust in your own voice and sort of your own storytelling. I think we all naturally, from an art standpoint and from a storytelling standpoint, and I'll focus more on sort of the artistic style of it because I think that's a big sort of debate about like developing your own style and making something original. And I think we all naturally, like when we draw, we have a certain style that we just sort of naturally do. And when it becomes difficult is when you try to sort of replicate another style a little bit too much. And I think if you just sort of trust in your own line quality and the way that you naturally draw, that's when you sort of create your best work because one, it's more efficient because you're not if it just comes naturally, like you're going to work quicker, it's going to be more enjoyable. Um, but also like it'll be sort of innately original because it's specific to you, like it is original to you.
Do you have a favorite step in the actual drawing process?
I love the sketching phase. I think I love sort of when things are really gestural and I have so many files on my iPad that are just just really rough sketches that I would never sort of post anywhere. But sometimes that's like the most enjoyable time drawing that I have is just sketching. It's sort of when I have to color, I'm not as excited about it, but the sort of gestural stage is my favorite.
I think there is something so charming and expressionistic about your style as well. It almost has reminiscent of like Persepolis or that kind of style of graphic novel. Do you
Yeah.
think that by having this kind of iconic or graphic look that the characters are somehow like more emotive?
Yeah, I mean, I think like when you understand how to like sort of simplify something, you can really get down to sort of the core emotion. Definitely, I would say that with sort of my graphic design background, I gravitate towards a more graphic style. So I'm looking at it from a sort of, that sort of the high contrast, really simple style. That's what I really like. So yeah.
Very nice. Well, we mentioned that the first volume is sold out. It's definitely taking off. Do you have any tips for building an audience online?
Yeah, for patience, I would say. It takes time, and I think it's not. I think we all now know this. Social media's been around for a while, but building an audience, it's one of those things that sort of happens gradually and then suddenly. A lot of times, like you'll slowly be building followers, and then sometimes you'll be picked up by, you'll be featured somewhere, or you have some sort of viewership, and then it just spikes. So I think just taking time. And I think if you can hone into something specific, you're more likely to gain loyal readers. Um, there's a difference between getting someone to look at your work and getting them to sort of come back and sort of anticipate what you're going to make next. So if you can tap into something niche, I think that's more likely to happen. Also, there's a certain degree where you have to value quality over quantity. I think we love to look at numbers, and currently I don't have the biggest following at all, but I do have people who will tell me that they really love my work and they'll share my work, which I think is really cool. And it's important to not lose sight of that. That really why we sort of put art out there and why we share our stories is to have people that care about it.
Definitely. You want to have your audience in mind when you're creating, not just a mass audience.
Right, exactly.
So, when you are creating, how are you sure that you're going to be able to deliver to that audience? And do you have any time management tips?
Yeah, I think having really clear deadlines is helpful. I sort of spoke to um, creating a graphic novel versus creating a web comic. And I think the nice thing about a web comic is you can take it in smaller chunks and have sort of weekly deadlines. Having like a weekly deadline, I think, is much more doable than like a monthly or yearly deadline, because how do you sort of break that up into smaller pieces? Um, so having those really clear deadlines that you set to, like for me, I upload every Sunday, and I stick to that as best I can. Um, I think for the most part, people are really understanding. So if you need a break, you can absolutely take it. And I think that taking a break is very important. But that's been really helpful for me. Um, and I think giving yourself time off too. You know, when you're working on a passion project, there are no sort of like clear dividing lines. When you go into a job, you're like, okay, I get in at 9, I have a lunch break, and then I get off at 6. But when you're working on a passion project, you could really work on it at any time. But you need breaks to sort of do your best work. So for me, I've sort of given myself Fridays off. I tell myself that I don't do anything on Fridays, because there'll sometimes be days where I tell myself, it's like Saturday, and I keep telling myself I'm going to draw, and I don't end up drawing anything, but I have stressed out the whole day that I need to be drawing. And I just don't think that's healthy. So I think if you're able to just accept the fact that I'm not going to get any drawing done today, and that's okay, I think that's a really healthy way to go about it.
Yes, that sounds very familiar for some odd reason.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, I love to ask people about like self care and work life balance. So that's perfect. You kind of answered that. Is there anything else in particular that you find important to take on for yourself that's separate from art?
Yeah, I mean, I think having other hobbies that you do, is important. So you're not just focused in on one thing. Like, I like to go outside, I like to climb, just like, do other things than art. So you're not like, so you don't get burnout.
That's right. You've mentioned like as in rock climbing, right?
Yes, yes.
That is so cool. How long have you been doing that?
I've been doing it for since about like 2016, I'd say. Um, that's definitely the other big part of my personality. One day maybe I'll do a rock climbing comic, but um, you know, that'll be once this one's done.
And that leads into another question too. Do you have any other stories or projects planned that we can be looking out for in the future?
Yes, absolutely. I think there are so many stories I want to tell, so it's more of a question of what would be the next one. What would be the one I pick? I have a specific one that I definitely want to work on after this, and my goal for that one is to make it more of a short story. Sort of previously, all of the comics I've set out to do have been very long. And I think that's because it's hard to tell short stories. Short stories are really hard to tell. It's hard to get really substantial character development and themes and a good story arc in a short amount of time. So I think that's why it's really common that people will, start a story and it'll just keep going on and meander because it's hard to sort of close up those things that you've set up. So my goal for my next one is to make it shorter.
That's a good goal. That's definitely hard to achieve, but I appreciate that. um, will it be in the same genre? Is it always for you like some sort of supernatural element with like character focus?
Yeah, this one I would say is probably going to be a little more sort of supernatural, but definitely character focused. It's only two characters, so I think that'll be sort of interesting to, St. Catherine definitely has a lot of characters, and it's focusing on one person's life, so it's really easy to introduce a lot of different characters. But in this next one, I'm mainly just focusing on two characters and again, it's sort of a similar thing where while the environment is a little more supernatural, the main focus is more just on sort of the character dynamics.
Well, that's exciting. We'll have to keep an eye out for that when that happens as well. As far as wrapping things up, do you have any parting advice for aspiring young comic book artists?
Sort of speaking to that, I would say start small,
Mm.
learn from my mistakes. um, I think it's really important to finish things. There's that idea of that done is better than perfect. Um, we all have ideas. We all have these projects that we're working on, and it's the projects that are finished that really make the difference. What's done is done, and I'm about a third of the way through St. Catherine's, so there's really no going back now. But if I could do it over again, I probably would have started with a shorter story. You learn so much through the process of making a comic, so if you're able to create a shorter story and learn along the way, but very quickly complete something, I think that's really powerful and a really good way to if you want to break into the comic world, that's a really great way to do it.
I agree. Very nice. And where can we find you? What are all your social medias?
Yeah, my social medias are all the same. So it's Bruzierke, Brusierkee, and yeah, that's on Twitter and Instagram.
All right. Well, I will be sure to include that in the description. And again, thank you so much. This was an awesome conversation. I love hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you again, Anna, so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. I am really happy after seeing the 2 first interviews posted that you guys are enjoying this as well. It really pumps me up to be able to talk to people who do what I do and who enjoy reading comics as well. So to hear you guys enjoying that also is really uplifting and fun, and I'm excited to bring you more. Definitely be sure to check out Anna's social media in the description below, and if you are so inclined, please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're at all interested in what I'm doing, I have a webtoon too, so be sure to check that out as well. Be sure to check back next week on Monday.